Story 1. There was a period in my life when I was addicted to horror movies. Every night I was immersed in the world of horror and mysticism. In those days, when I lived alone, nothing interfered with my movie marathon. I usually went to bed by morning. One day, when I went to bed as usual and turned out the light, I was suddenly awakened by a strange rustling, something like scraping on the surface. At first I thought it was the cats, but both were lying quietly on my feet. I listened and noticed that the noise had subsided. From that day on, I decided not to watch horror movies. But even when I went to bed in the evening, I was still worried. Almost at the same time as last night, I was awakened again by a strange noise coming from the hallway. I didn't dare get up, but I was almost certain that the sound was coming from the mirror. It was as if someone was slowly running their fingernails over the glass. After a while, the noise stopped. The next day I decided not to go to work because I felt sick. During the day, I noticed that one of the cats was acting strangely. She was standing by the nightstand next to the bed, looking at her reflection in the mirror. Stayed like that for a couple hours. There was a mirror in the bathroom, too. I had always considered myself brave, but after the horrors I was afraid. Even in the shower I kept looking at the mirror, and all the time I felt as if someone was watching me. When it was time to sleep, fear possessed me, and it was difficult to fall asleep. Suddenly I woke up to a new sound, like a monotonous voice somewhere. At first I thought it was the neighbors, but soon I realized that the sound was coming from the corridor. I tried to make out what it was, but the sound suddenly stopped. Fear took hold of me and I stayed lying there trying to sleep. Finally, to calm the fear, I turned on the light. Toward dawn, I heard faint laughter. In the morning, he decided to change things up and spend the night at a friend's house. But I noticed that the cat was standing in front of the bathroom mirror again. He was indifferent to my attempts to attract his attention, as if subordinated to the reflection. I decided to take a shower, closed my eyes, and suddenly, while standing under the shower with my eyes closed, I saw something in the mirror. An empty bathtub, a shower curtain, and there, right next to it, a face slowly appearing. A green face with a feral grin. Feeling the creature in the mirror laughing, I flung the curtain aside in horror. There was no one there, but I trembled, felt the presence of something. I don't remember how quickly I got dressed and ran away, but there was a feeling that someone was watching, waiting for something. Before my mom arrived, I tried not to be alone, but even now, when I walk past the mirrors, I think I sometimes hear a quiet laugh. The cat continues to sit on the nightstand, staring at my reflection as if he sees something I don't see. Story 2. Since the beginning of last year, I have been plagued by insomnia. I can lie in complete darkness for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the clock counting down every second right next to my ear. It was on one of those nights, in the early days of February, when there was deep silence outside and the moon was not peeking out from behind the clouds, that it started to snow heavily. I was in the apartment all alone. Then I realized, how could this child reach the doorbell? Why wouldn't he answer my questions? Where did he come from? There are no children of that age in our neighborhood. These thoughts sent a chill down to my very bones. I was still staring at the boy, and suddenly he contorted his lips, his face darkening instantly. He opened his mouth and uttered, "Dante, look at me." His voice was hoarse and squeaky, like an old man ass. "Dante, look, or it will be worse." He added, "My mom and dad went to visit my godmother, but they couldn't get back home because the buses weren't running because of the bad weather." I went to bed much later than usual, about 1:00 in the morning. I usually go to bed earlier since I have class in the morning, but as soon as I lay down and my head touched the pillow, I immediately realized that sleep was not coming. Finally, as before, I lay on my back and lay perfectly still, thinking about different things and waiting for the sky to start getting lighter, because I know that with the first rays of morning light I will finally fall asleep. My mom and dad went to visit my godmother, but they couldn't get back home because the buses weren't running because of the bad weather. I went to bed much later than usual, about 1:00 in the morning. I usually go to bed earlier since I have class in the morning, but as soon as I lay down and my head touched the pillow, I immediately realized that sleep was not coming. Finally, as before, I lay on my back and lay perfectly still, thinking about different things and waiting for the sky to start getting lighter, because I know that with the first rays of morning light I will finally fall asleep. About 5 years ago, there was a period of time when my mother would tell me in the morning about strange nighttime doorbells. They would happen deep in the night, sometime between 2 and 3 o'clock. Someone would ring insistently and demandingly. My mom was surprised that no one but her heard these calls, and every time she got up to ask through the closed door, "Who is there?" But there was always silence in reply. Before leaving for work, she complained to my father and me that at night again someone came and called, but never showed up. These strange visits were repeated every week like a schedule. Eventually, my mother decided not to come to the door anymore, and the calls stopped for a while. I listened, but there was no sound behind the door. Silence. And then I got a chill. A chill. A chill. The bell rang again. I cautiously stood on my tiptoes and looked through the peephole. The corridor was illuminated by the bright light of the lamps. I saw a boy about 10 years old in front of my door, dressed in a simple fur coat, without a hat, in felt boots, mittens hanging on elastic bands from the sleeves. He had dark hair, a round face without much expression, and large, pale eyes. There was snow outside, but not a single snowflake on the boy, and his clothes were perfectly dry. He raised his head and looked up, as if he knew I was watching him. I shrieked in horror and drew back into the hallway. At the same time, the door began to scratch, and from behind it came hoarse mutterings. Saw. I stood frozen with horror, not knowing what to do. The scratching and wheezing continued from the side of the door. "Lord," I shouted, "protect me from the evil power." And I began to make the signs of the cross with a trembling hand in front of the door. "Help me, O Lord, protect me from the evil one." And immediately, as if by prayer, the grinding stopped. Something hoarse hit the door and fell silent. I continued to draw the signs of the cross in the air. I stood like that for another 10 minutes. Then I listened. There was silence all around. I didn't dare to look through the peephole. I went back into the room, turned on the light, and sat like that until I finally fell asleep from fatigue and exhaustion. I shrieked in horror and drew back into the hallway. At the same time, the door began to scratch, and from behind it came hoarse mutterings. Saw. I stood frozen with horror, not knowing what to do. The scratching and wheezing continued from the side of the door. "Lord," I shouted, "protect me from the evil power." And I began to make the signs of the cross with a trembling hand in front of the door. "Help me, O Lord, protect me from the evil one." And immediately, as if by prayer, the grinding stopped. Something hoarse hit the door and fell silent. I continued to draw the signs of the cross in the air. I stood like that for another 10 minutes. Then I listened. There was silence all around. I didn't dare to look through the peephole. I went back into the room, turned on the light, and sat like that until I finally fell asleep from fatigue and exhaustion. Story 3. What happened yesterday was unfathomable, but for some reason I felt that these women might know the answers to my questions. So here I was again, on the same platform, and I was rather uncomfortable. "Why did you come here with flowers?" I asked. The two women, who were both in their 70s, began to tell me their story. I was completely stunned and decided that it was high time to run away from there. And so I did, running as fast as I could toward home. The next evening, I was passing by the park again, and I unconsciously glanced toward that very playground. There were two women standing there, one holding flowers, the other leaning over and carefully placing them on the ground near the swings. The girl had short blonde hair and was dressed in pink pants and a jacket with a white pattern. It was really hard to listen to her cheerful laughter and songs amidst the woman's sorrowful tears. As the girl ran past, I tried to interest her, to get her attention, but she seemed to be too absorbed in her amusement. Eventually the girl stopped and I walked closer to her. She was looking straight at the ground. "Baby, what is your name? Aren't you tired from running around?" I asked her, but the girl didn't answer or even raise her head. I sat down beside her to look into her face. What I saw puzzled and frightened me at the same time. Her eyes were surprisingly large and completely black. Suddenly she blinked and her lips moved slightly. When she spoke, her voice sounded low and rough, as if it were the voice of the devil. It was about 8 o'clock in the evening when I got home from driving school. I warmed up dinner and sat down to watch my favorite TV series. After watching the last available series, I found out that new episodes would not be released soon, which made me a little upset. I tried to find something else to watch, but nothing piqued my interest. Pushing my plate aside, I decided it would be better to take a short walk and headed to the nearest park. The feeling of unease came over me again. I really wanted to help this woman, to calm her down, but I didn't know how to approach her. I tried to talk to her, but she continued to ignore me, not responding to my words. She kept repeating the same phrases, as if she was lost in her grief and sorrow. When I had already exhausted all my comforting words, a girl caught my attention. She got off the swing and started running around our bench, humming a tune from a children's song. I usually felt calm and safe in the park, but that evening was an exception. As I passed the first playground, hidden between the trees, I felt a vague uneasiness and a slight shiver ran through my body, making me nervous. As I approached the second site, I calmed down slightly when I noticed a woman there with a child of about 2 years old. I walked closer and sat down on a bench not far from them. The baby was happily swinging on the swing, making a laughing noise that seemed a little strange to me. The woman was opposite the swing, and I couldn't see her face. I sat for about 15 minutes, watching the still picture in front of me. Then I got up and walked closer, sitting down on the bench next to the woman. She was wearing a long skirt and a sweater with sleeves, holding a handkerchief, mumbling something inaudible and crying, wiping her tears with a handkerchief. The little girl kept swinging on the swing and laughing with a laugh that didn't sound like a child's. I tried to make out the woman's words. She spoke in jagged phrases. Give her back to me. Why? Why did you have to do that? She was everything to me and something like that. Story 4. Time swept by with invisible wings. Grandma passed away. I grew up, found a family, became a mother. My husband and I acquired a spacious dwelling. During the 6 years of being together, my husband and I avoided disagreements and resentments, but all good things sooner or later come to an end. I was afraid to even move, but the sound under the bed only intensified, as if someone was fiddling, grunting, sniffling. Suddenly I remembered my grandmother's words about quarrels and houses. It became clear to me we had awakened the house elf. But why did it come to me and not to my husband? For example, when I was a child, my grandmother used to say, "Don't whisper, don't shout, or you'll disturb the sleeping houseboy." And so, 30 years later, I accidentally woke him up. I grew up in joy and laughter, spending a lot of time at my grandparents' house as my mom was always busy at work. They separated from my father when I was very young. Thoughts swirled around in my head, and the cold permeated my entire body. I lay on the bed as if paralyzed, unable to move. Suddenly, I thought someone was coming toward me. My heart raced to my heels, and I jumped up instantly, rushing into the kitchen. I was shaking with fear. What was that? I spent the rest of the night in the kitchen, half asleep, with the light on and the TV on. My attempts to please the housekeeper with sweets were in vain. Almost every night something fell off the shelves, dishes rattled, and when I cooked, everything seemed to jump out of my hand spontaneously, as if someone was pushing me under my elbow. Determined to take one last step, I put the baby to bed and sat in the darkened living room to try to talk to the houseboy. It might sound crazy, but I was so tired of these small but frightening events that happened in our house all the time. In my long monologue, I expressed all my feelings and emotions, shedding tears. I begged the housekeeper to stop scaring me and, on the contrary, to help bring calmness to the house. And he heard me. It was as if someone sat down next to me. At first, my feet felt cool, but then they became very warm, as if someone had gently embraced me and warmed me. The excitement was gone. My thoughts cleared. I suddenly felt that everything was going to be all right. Since then, our meetings with my husband in the apartment became less frequent, and our conversations passed without scandals. 6 months later, we divorced and he left. I stayed with Mary in the apartment. The old domestic atmosphere returned and things began to settle down. Happiness returned to our family, though not completely. Perhaps there is hardly any family that is without conflict, but every time you raise your voice, remember that at one point it can bore even a houseboy. In the evening, my husband came home, but we didn't talk. He stayed the night, but we slept in separate rooms. Once again, the night was strange. Suddenly, around 2:00 am, I heard some crunching under the bed. We don't have pets, and there are usually no rats on the 6th floor. I opened my eyes, but I couldn't see anything. It was completely dark, but the rustling under the bed was clearly audible. It was probably the scariest moment of my life. I was alone in the darkened living room, standing at the window and sobbing. My daughter was in her room. The apartment was dead silent. Suddenly, from the farthest corner of the room, I heard a barely perceptible rustle, and a shiver ran down my spine at the sensation of someone's presence. The thought flashed through my mind, it is not a person, it has something from another world. But I dismissed the strange thought at once. "Mary, it has time for bed," I said quietly, turning to my daughter. In our 7th year together, we had a disagreement. I discovered that my husband was seeing someone else. Our domestic comfort began to disintegrate, and with it, the tranquility of our home. The walls shook with daily shouting and arguments. The children's laughter was replaced by tears. One evening, an argument with my husband reached a climax. We shouted at each other, and in the middle of the argument he shouted, "I don't love you or this house." After which he slammed the door loudly and disappeared into the darkness of the night. My grandmother was a serious and deeply religious woman, and she also believed in various superstitions. In the evenings, she liked to give me fascinating stories, and I was especially imbued with stories about the housekeeper, who protects the house from troubles, but only if you observe the unspoken laws of coexistence with him. Domovoi does not tolerate when you leave dirty dishes at night, is categorically against sitting on the doorstep, but most of all he is annoyed by shouting in the house. Family quarrels and noisy proceedings can wake up the house boy, and then he, like an angry bear, becomes fiery and seeks to expel those who have disturbed the peace. The room was empty. I went into the children's room and saw my daughter lying on her bed. I felt uneasy and had goosebumps all over my body. I couldn't sleep and left the light on all night because my husband never came home for the night. I had a bad dream and was plagued with anxious thoughts. When I woke up early in the morning, I went to the kitchen. When I opened the cupboard, there were mugs spilling out of it as if someone had thrown them. I didn't pay much attention to it at the time, thinking that maybe I hadn't cleaned up well yesterday, although that was unusual for me. Then I took my daughter to the garden and, in a bad mood, went to work.